Today, we're joined by one of those young, energetic insurgents who is taking on a powerful, elite, institutional Democratic congressman.
It's time we acknowledge that not all Democrats are the same. That a Democrat who takes corporate money, profits off foreclosure, doesn't live here, doesn't send his kids to our schools, doesn't drink our water or breathe our air, cannot possibly represent us. What the Bronx and Queens...
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a candidate for the House of Representatives in New York's 14th District. She was born to a Puerto Rican family in the South Bronx. She's young, she's working class, she's a New Yorker who has been immersed in community-based leadership, organizing, and service work. After earning her degree from Boston University, she moved back home to the Bronx, was working long hours as a waitress to support her family in the aftermath of her father's untimely death. Her dad, like many working-class people, died without a will. And so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her family found themselves fighting a nasty, cold bureaucracy that featured legal vultures who carved off parts of her father's estate for profit as Alexandria and her family struggled to make ends meet. She said she never planned on running for office, but after traveling across the country, from Flint, Michigan to Standing Rock, asking Americans about issues they were facing in the aftermath of Trump's election, the progressive organization Brand New Congress got in touch with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and asked her if she'd be willing to run for Congress. Her opponent is the powerful Democrat, Representative Joe Crowley. He's the current chair of the House Democratic caucus, and he's been trying to position himself as the successor to Nancy Pelosi as the leader of the Democrats and the future Speaker of the House. This district, where Crowley is a congressman, is one of the most racially and culturally diverse in the United States. It spans parts of Queens and the Bronx. The district also includes the notorious Rikers Prison. Crowley has held that seat since 1999, and he has not faced a primary challenger since at least 2004. Well, this year, he's going to. And that challenger, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, joins me now. Alexandria, welcome to Intercepted.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start by talking about the way that ICE has evolved since its creation. You've been tweeting a lot in response to this ACLU report that came out with 30,000 pages or so of documentation of how families, children, civilians are treated under the ICE program. How has ICE's actions changed from Obama to Trump? Is there anything that's markedly different?
There are things that are markedly different. I would say that the basic infrastructure of ICE, its legal structures are the same, but the latitude and rather the extent to which the Trump administration is really bending these rules is at an absolutely new level. This idea of, most recently separating children from their parents in order to kind of force the state to take over their custody is just an extremely different and draconian level to which ICE enforcement is now being taken. The Trump administration is changing these policies at a breakneck pace. So even the most prolific immigration lawyers in the country can barely keep up with the changes that they're making here. And we're seeing things that started in the Obama administration, ICE showing up at courtrooms and things like that, are just starting to become much more regular and commonplace.
What's your understanding of this policy that ends up separating parents from children? Like, where was that born?
So basically, the United States had a standing policy for minors who showed up at the border. And what that was originally designed for was occasionally you would have teenagers, mostly people who are 14, 15, under 18, but old enough to kind of navigate the world on their own. And they would show up at our borders. And we kind of previously saw this hit a crisis when we had this wave of young people and children showing up at the borders of South Texas after the regime change in Honduras.
Since October, 52,000 unaccompanied children have been picked up trying to cross into the U.S., a 99% increase over last year. The Border Patrol has also seen a record number of adults with kids crossing.
And so we had a standing policy for when a minor showed up at the border unaccompanied, the U.S. government would intervene. There would be child custody services and things like that to help that child navigate that system. That is what we were initially dealing with. Now what's happening is parents who show up with their children at the border are getting separated from their children. And that has never happened before. Before, those families would be processed together. And now we are seeing things, I believe it was on MSNBC, where we're actually seeing cases of 53-week-old infant in court on their own, separated from their mothers.
We've actually seen children who are 2 years old regularly. And just last week, we saw a 53-week-old infant in court without a parent.
I'm sorry. I'm having a really hard time thinking about this. So a 53-week-old infant comes with presumably his or her mother, and they're apprehended by Customs Border Patrol, and then they're processed in some way. And at some point, someone from the government in a uniform comes and physically takes a 53-week-old baby away from the mother.
That's correct, yeah.
And many of these children, have yet to see their parents ever again. And some of these children don't even have legal defense. So this is beyond the pale. This is just totally beyond the pale.
Jeff Sessions, at least for now, the Attorney General, in defending this policy, said the following in a series of speeches in Arizona, which is known for its really harsh, draconian position on immigration, as well as in San Diego, California, which is Southern California. This is Sessions.
It's an offense to enter the country unlawfully. If you smuggle an illegal alien across the border, then we'll prosecute you for smuggling. If you're smuggling a child, then we're going to prosecute you. And that child will be separated from you probably as required by law. If you don't want your child to be separated, then don't bring him across the border illegally. It's not our fault that somebody does that.
Your response?
Well, first of all, we are seeing people showing up on claiming refugee status. We have this very clear case of this Congolese woman who showed up refugee status. And if you are fleeing persecution in your home country, the United States refugee policy is that you can show up to our borders, claim refugee status, say, I'm a refugee, and be classified as such. We've had generations of Americans that have come from things like the Rwandan genocide and regime changes in Latin America show up and claim refugee status. And we are doing this to those people too. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing is that when you have undocumented people show up in our border, usually what you do is turn them away. That has been the historic policy of the United States. People who show up undocumented without a visa, we turn them away at our borders. But the idea of prosecuting anybody who just shows up at a checkpoint is an expansion of what we are doing in this country. And in fact, we are taking these people in and we're putting them into this black box detention system that we have allowed ICE to create. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that ICE is now the second largest criminal investigative agency in the United States, second only to the FBI. And the fact that they operate without the accountability of the Department of Justice is extremely concerning to us all. There are threads here that stretch all the way to warrantless wiretapping and other forms of overreach. This is squarely in the category of civil rights abuses.
When you say there's no oversight from the Justice Department, what do you mean?
So basically, ICE operates under the Department of Homeland Security. And in my opinion, to have a criminal investigative agency that is not housed under the Department of Justice is so backwards, especially when we see that the Department of Homeland Security was just created in 2003. And so this is not an agency with the institutional knowledge or support or structures to handle such a large operation. And it's very clear that we see, while the Department of Justice, at least towards the end of the Obama administration, started winding down its systems of for-profit detention, for example, for-profit prisons, ICE has just had an expansion. As a matter of fact, ICE is the only criminal investigative agency, the only enforcement agency in the United States that has a bed quota. So ICE is required to fill 34,000 beds with detainees every single night. And that number has only been increasing since 2009. There is the acknowledgement that these things did start with the Obama administration. But again, that is always the danger of creating governmental structures without accountability under the premise of just trust us. This guy, this one president is fine. We can trust this one president. Because when we do have draconian administrations like the one we have now, we see exactly what happens.
Well, and people a lot of times say, well, why do you criticize the Democrats? The only game in town right now is opposing Trump. And I'm certainly sympathetic if you're looking at what are the greatest risks to democratic society, civil liberties, global peace. Yeah, this is a very dangerous administration. On the other hand, whether it's drone strikes or borderless wars or immigration policy, I feel like you would be omitting an essential part of the context if you don't talk about how Obama, in his 8 years, created systems that were dependent on trusting in him rather than, hey, here's the rules for how this
right.
is done. And, and I think a lot of people that didn't pay any attention to these issues, particularly immigration under Obama, are now waking up because it's Trump. But when are we going to break that cycle where you're confronting the Democratic Party establishment in your race for Congress? You're going up against a longtime member of Congress who there's discussion he may one day be the Speaker of the House or the leader of the Democrats in the Congress. But the role that the institutional elite or the mainstream of Democratic Party politicians play in creating the ground for Trump to do something like this.
First of all, the idea of immigration as a partisan issue, the idea of war as a partisan issue, the idea of certain issues that should be galvanizing around social, economic, and racial justice that all of us should be agreeing on are now becoming partisan. And so what's concerning to me about saying Trump, 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 or GOP, 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 is that in the history of the United States, particularly the modern history of the United States, immigration has never been a partisan issue. In fact, George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, not to defend or evangelize their administrations, but they were actually known to be quite liberal on immigration. Reagan had his amnesty policy.
This bill, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that I'll sign in a few minutes, is the most comprehensive reform of our immigration laws since 1952. It's the product of one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings in the last three Congresses. Further, it's an excellent example of a truly successful bipartisan effort.
You have George W. Bush that was actually very welcoming in both his rhetoric and many of his policies towards immigrants, despite the creation of ICE. And so historically, immigration has not been a partisan issue until the rising racial resentments of the Trump administration and what we have recently seen in perhaps the last 5 years. Issues that are just morally right and wrong are now starting to be hijacked by both parties as partisan issues, which should be very, very concerning to all of us as American citizens. Moreover, the fact that the Democratic Party has not been the party of immigrants. And 10 years ago, I had worked in Ted Kennedy's immigration office, and he, to his credit, he had one of the best immigration constituent service offices in the country. And I would be handling some of these cases, and women and families would call me in a total panic because their husbands were scooped off the street in the middle of the day, or they came home. And there are literally stories of people coming home to their front doors open and, their stove flames are still on and their families are missing. And our incumbents created that system. Everyone who voted for it is responsible, period. And they need to be held accountable. And if they're not actively calling for the abolition of ICE, then I don't want to hear it. This idea that we're going to fight Trump without taking hard, committed stances is just a farce, and it's a media play. And I do think that our Democratic establishment has to take ownership over the mistakes that they have made in the past. I mean, they should either acknowledge their past actions as mistakes and commit to a course correction, or if they don't acknowledge that their actions were a mistake, frankly, they need to go.
You dropped a little mini bomb in there that I want to rewind and examine. You said that you're calling for abolishing ICE. I think maybe not people who listen to this show or are supporting you on your campaign, but a lot of people in America, I think, would listen to that and think, so what does she want? She just wants people to pour in here. We shouldn't have any immigration. So when you're running for Congress, so explain from a policy perspective how you can have that position, let's abolish ICE, and be running for Congress in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and a little bit of context to the community that I'm running in. My community, New York 14, it's half in Queens, half in the Bronx. It's half immigrant. So our communities are very, very familiar with U.S. immigration policy. If you are not an immigrant or naturalized U.S. citizen yourself, you either are part of an immigrant family or you are very close to immigrants. And so I do think that if any seat should be calling for the abolishment of ICE, it should be New York 14, among others. There are several others. And yeah, that's always the question. Like, what do you expect? Are you an open borders fanatic? Like all of these things. And people forget that ICE was established in 2003 in the post 9/11, frankly, authoritarian crackdown where we saw the Patriot Act, the Iraq War, the AUMF, and then, of course, you have the establishment of the Homeland Security, which included the establishment of ICE. And that's when we first started seeing, again, this enforcement agency that does not answer to the Department of Justice. Before ICE, we had the INS. So we had the Immigration and Naturalization Services. There are very intense operations that we do need to monitor. We have to keep tabs on human trafficking, child sex trafficking, child pornography, and of course, just standard immigration in and out. And so the INS had handled that before. And so criminal investigations would get forwarded to the Department of Justice, which had the infrastructure to kind of handle those proceedings. And then there were other investigatory arms either within the FBI or within Health and Human Services that would handle those different pockets. Now, when the Department of Homeland Security was established, it concentrated and centralized all of those things into one. And those operations in and of themselves can continue. You know, you can have border and customs do the things that they have always done. The one line that I do want to draw is that when I started talking about this over the weekend, it kind of recently blew up. And I'm starting to see particularly other congressional candidates say, let's return to the INS. And that I want to make sure is not correct either. This is not about going back to the INS. This is really about, in some ways, we need to go all the way back to the root of our immigration policy to begin with, which the very first immigration policy law passed in the United States was the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. And so the very seed, the very bedrock of U.S. immigration policy, the very beginning of it was a policy based on racial exclusion. And I think that we need to really reimagine our immigration policy based around two things, like I had said before, foreign policy and criminal justice, and additionally our economic goals as well. And we really kind of need, I think, to reimagine our immigration services as part of an economic engine, as part of an accommodation to our own foreign policy aims, and where necessary, enforcement of serious crimes like human trafficking and so on. So abolishing ICE doesn't mean get rid of our immigration policy, but what it does mean is to get rid of the draconian enforcement that has happened since 2003 that routinely violates our civil rights because, frankly, it was designed with that structure in mind.
Just to change gears for a moment, Joe Crowley, who sort of is the self-declared king of Queens, is obviously from Queens, represents Queens. Trump is from Queens.
Yeah.
The governor of New York, Cuomo, is from Queens. Talk about the sort of men of Queens and the political, not just the political machine that you're fighting in the Democratic Party, but the sort of culture of politics in the part of the area where you would represent.
Yeah. I mean, it's a trip. It's a trip because excluding Trump for a moment, all of these guys really love to engage in performative solidarity. I'm going to, maybe get in trouble with this, but Cuomo recently had this whole speech where he literally stands up on this stage and he says, I am a Black woman. I am undocumented. And I think that the real mistake here is just that There's a lot of talking about these communities, but at the end of the day, their grip on power causes them to refuse to actually give these communities a true seat at the table. And when these communities want to run for office, or when these communities want to have real teeth in our legislative and political processes, they only allow those whom they give permission. And so it's a real systemic problem. People think of New York as a liberal state. People think of New York City as liberal politics, and it's not. And then also you look at New York State, New York City, one of the most diverse cities in the United States. We're 56% people of color. We're majority female. And in that city, our governor, our mayor, our city council speaker, the chairman of our state party, and Crowley himself, who's the chairman of the Queens Democratic Party, are all one gender and one race. They are all white men. And that is statistically almost impossible. So that is not done by chance. That is the systemic concentration of power. And the systemic concentration of power that falls along historical lines, falls along the empowerment and the concentration of power that tends to be along men, that tends to be along, white Americans. And that is how, if the most diverse city in America can't get a person of color or someone that's not a man to have high office, then how can we have that hope for any other place in the United States?
One of the things I noticed on your Twitter feed is you've been intimating and at times describing directly the sexism and misogyny that you've experienced as you've run your campaign for Congress against a white man who's been around for a long time. Talk about being you and being in this campaign and what it means to be a young woman of color challenging an establishment Democrat.
Yeah, I think it's amusing because a lot of people start losing their minds when I talk about this. Oh, she's making this about identity, this term identity politics. And it's really funny because when I just talk about who our community is, when I just say, hey, New York 14 is 70% people of color. We're 60% Hispanic. We're 40% primarily Spanish speaking. We're also overwhelmingly working class. We have a lot of white brothers and sisters out here too, right in the same boat as us, making $47,000 a year on average in New York City. People in the opposite camp have been saying she's making this about race. And you know what? It is about race. And it is about education, and it is about our incomes, and it is about wealth inequality, because this campaign is about our issues. And what is infuriating, I think, a lot of people in New York's political establishment is that I haven't asked anyone for permission. And there's always this go back to who is she? And I mean, when I look upwards, and even when I try, like if I hypothetically wanted to, quote unquote, do it the right way and ask for this permission and work through these channels, there's no people up there that would help me. There are no women in power in New York City in like an authentic, we got some borough presidents, we got some folks out here, but we have no people of color that are the city council speaker right now. We have none of that. We have very few working class Americans as well. And so what you see as well is that this machine has been overwhelmingly male for so long that the misogyny becomes the political culture of New York City politics.
What is your relationship with the institutional Democratic Party like? DCCC, the DNC?
My opponent is the institutional Democratic Party. So my relationship to them in a formal sense is pretty much non-existent. He gives the D-Trip, I think, about $1 million a year on average, some years and stuff. So
this is the Democratic campaign fundraising mechanism that's used by the institutional party.
Right.
Has the Democratic Party tried to stop you from challenging Crowley?
No one has tried to dissuade me from running. And I think it's because when I started this race, I was so small potatoes. My background, for those who may not know, I'm an educator, I'm an organizer, I have an academic background in economics and international policy, but I'm also very working class. I'm a first generation college graduate. And during the financial crisis, which eviscerated my family, I was bartending and waitressing while doing community work. We sold my childhood home. My mother was forced to move to Florida because she could no longer afford to live in New York City, remain in New York City. And I found myself, while we were kind of on that brink, I started working a second job. And so when I first started this campaign, I started it out of a grocery bag, going to work, and I put my palm cards and my campaign banner in a grocery bag, and I put my change of clothes for the end of that day, and I would take it to a bar, and I would hide it behind the counter. I would work my shift for that day. I would get out. I would change my clothes. I would go to community events. I would go to people's living rooms and say, hey, we need to change our politics in America. And that's how this campaign started. And it was such a joke, I think, to the establishment, and it was so small potatoes that nobody paid attention and nobody thought of us as a threat, which I think is a fabulous place to be. We haven't had a primary in 14 years in New York 14, so it was very clear that nobody else was going to do this. And so in a way, in New York City, to challenge a kingmaker, you have to do it from the outside because everyone else is too scared.
Alexandria, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a candidate for the House of Representatives in New York's 14th District. Her website is ocasio2018.com. Make sure to also check out the profile of Ocasio-Cortez by my colleagues Aida Chavez and Ryan Grimm at theintercept.com. That piece is called A Primary Against the Machine.